In the last video, you learned how to listen to those built-in events, things like connection events and disconnection events. Those are fine. They're a great starting place. But in this video, what we want to talk about is emitting and listening to custom events. And this is where Socket.io gets really interesting. When you're able to emit and listen to custom events, you can send anything you want from the server to the client or from the client to the server. Now, to go through a quick example of how that'll look, we're going to use an example app, an email application. On the left, we have our server. This is starting up a Socket.io web server. On the right, we have our email app, which is showing a list of all our current emails. Now, one custom event that our app might require is a new email event. The new email event is going to get emitted by the server when an email comes in from someone else. For example, I sign up to a new service. That service sends me an email to confirm my email. The server eventually gets that email and it emits an event that the client listens to. The client is going to listen for the new email event, and it'll be able to re-render the list of emails in the browser using jQuery, React, Ember, or whatever library it happens to be using, showing the new email to the user. Now, aside from just sending that an event happened, the most important piece to the puzzle is sending data, and we can actually do that. When you create and emit a custom event, you can send whatever information you like from the server to the client or from the client to the server. Usually this takes the form of an object with various properties. In the case of getting a new email, I might want to know who the email is from. I definitely need to know the text of the email, and I also want to know when the email arrived at my server so I can render that inside of the browser for whoever happens to be using the email app. Now, this is data flowing from the server to the client, which is something we were not able to accomplish with HTTP requests, but it is something we can accomplish using Socket.io. Now, another event, this one, create email, is going to flow from the client to the server. When I create a new email inside of my web browser, I'm going to need to emit that event from the client, and the server is going to listen for that event. Once again, we are going to be sending some data across, although the data will be a little different. We want to know who the email needs to get sent to. We need the text of the email, and maybe you want to schedule it for down the line. So a scheduled timestamp field could be used. Obviously, these are all example fields. Your fields for a real email app would probably be a little different. With this in place, though, we are ready to go ahead and actually create these two events inside of our application. Your challenge, which will come a little later in the course, is going to be to create custom events, not for an email app, but for our Messenger application. Let's dive in, starting with new email and create email. Before we start emitting or listening to custom events, let's go ahead and make a few tweaks to our client-side JavaScript. As you might have noticed in the last video, I accidentally used ES6 arrow functions inside of our client-side JavaScript code. And as I mentioned, we want to avoid this. The project is going to work correctly in Chrome, but if you tried to load this up on your mobile phone, Internet Explorer, Safari, or some versions of Firefox, the program is going to crash. So instead of using arrow functions, we're going to use regular functions by removing the arrow and adding the function keyword before our arguments. I'm going to do this for our onConnect listener and for the onDisconnect listener, adding the function keyword and removing the arrow. I'm also going to take our JavaScript and move it into a separate file. Instead of editing the client-side JavaScript right inside of our HTML file, we'll have a separate file where that code lives. This is the better method for getting things done. Over in public, we can make a new folder for this JavaScript file. I'm going to make one called JS. We'll have multiple JavaScript files by the time this app's over, so it's a good idea to create a folder to house all of those. For now, though, we just need one, index.js. Index.js is going to load when we load index.html. It's going to contain all of the JavaScript required to get this page to work, starting with the JavaScript we wrote down below. I'm going to cut out all of the code in the script tag, paste it into index.js. We can save the file and update our script tag. Instead of having the code in line, we're going to load it in by providing the source attribute with the path to the file, /js/index.js. Excellent. Now that we have this in place, we have the exact same functionality we had before, only this time around, the JavaScript has been broken out into its own file. I'm going to start up the server using node mon server /server.js. Once it's up, we can go ahead and load the app by going to the browser and opening up localhost 3000. I'm going to open up the developer tools as well so we can make sure everything is working as expected. And inside of the console, we see connected to server is still printing. This is code that exists in index.js, and the very fact that it's showing up here proves that the file was loaded. With this in place, we can now move on to our custom events. Now we have two events that we talked about for our example email application. We have new email, which is from the server to the client, and we have create email, which is an event emitted by the client and listened to by the server. We're going to get started with new email, and to kick things off, we're going to head into our client-side JavaScript, and we're going to listen for that event. When that event fires, we want to do something. We want to take the data, we want to use jQuery, React, or some other front-end framework to render it to the browser so the user can see the email as soon as it comes in. Now, in order to listen to a custom event, we are still going to use socket.on, although instead of specifying the name of one of the built-in events, we're going to, inside of quotes, provide the first argument as the name of our custom event. In this case, that name is going to be new, uppercase E, email. Now, the second argument for socket.on is the same as the second argument for the built-in event listeners. We're going to provide a function, and this function is going to get called when the event fires. For now, all we're going to do inside of here is use console.log to print a little message, new email. This is going to print inside of the web developer console every time the client hears this event coming across the pipeline. Now that we have the listener in place for new email, let's go ahead and emit this event over inside of server.js. In here, what we want to do is call a method on socket. Socket has a method called emit. We're going to use emit on both the client and the server to emit events. And emit is really similar to the listeners, although instead of listening to an event, we are creating the event. The first argument is the same. It's going to be the name of the event you want to emit. In this case, we have to match it exactly as we specified over here, new email. Right here, we're going to provide new email. Now, this is not a listener, so we're not going to provide a callback function. What we want to do is specify the data. Now, by default, we don't have to specify any data. Maybe we just want to emit new email without anything, letting the browser know that something happened. If we do this over inside of the browser, we can refresh the app, and what do we get in the terminal? We get new email right here. The event is still happening, even though we're not sending across any custom data. If you do want to send custom data, which is most likely the case, it's super easy. All you have to do is provide a second argument for email. Now, you could provide an argument of 3 or true or anything else, but most commonly, you want to send multiple pieces of data across, so an object is going to be your second argument. This is going to let you specify anything you like. In our case, we might specify who the email's from by specifying a from attribute. It's from mike@example.com. Maybe we also have the text for the email. Hey, what is going on? And we might have other attributes as well. For example, created at could be a timestamp of when the server got the email. This data is going to get sent along with the new email event from the server to the client. Now I'm going to go ahead and save server.js, and over inside of our client-side JavaScript, we can go ahead and do something with that data. The data that's emitted with your event is provided as the first argument to your callback function. Here we have our callback function for new email, which means we can name the first argument email, and we can do whatever we want with it. We might be appending it to a list of emails in a real web app, but for our purposes right now, all we're going to do is provide it as the second argument to console.log, rendering it to the screen. With this in place, we can now test that everything is working as expected. If I go to the browser and give things a refresh using Command R, we see over inside of the console, we have our new email, and down below we have our object. We can click it to expand it, and we see all of the properties we specified. We have our from property, the text property, our created at property, which is misspelled. All of it is showing up as expected. And this is fantastic. In real time, we were able to pass not only an event, but event data from the server to the client, which is something we could never do with an HTTP API. Now, on the other side of things, we have a situation where we want to emit an event from the client, sending some data to the server. This is for our create email event. Now, in this case, we are going to add our event listener inside of server.js using socket.on, just like we do for any other event listener, like we have right here. The io.on method we used for the connection event is a very special event. You will usually not be attaching anything to io. You're not going to make calls to io.on or io.emit other than the one we have here. Our custom event listeners are going to happen down below by calling socket.on like we do for disconnect, passing in the name of the event you want to listen to. In this case, it is the create email event. Now for create email, we do want to add a listener. We are in our node code, so we can use an arrow function. And we're probably going to expect some data, the email to create. So we can name that first argument. This is going to be the data sent along with the event. I'm going to call this new email. And for this example, all we're going to do is print it to the console so we can make sure the event is properly going from client to server. Console.log. I'm going to log out the event name, create email. And as the second argument, I'm going to log out the data so I can view it over here in the terminal and make sure everything works as expected. Now we have our listener in place and our server did restart, but we're never actually emitting the event on the client. We can go ahead and fix this by calling socket.emit. Now I'm going to call it right here inside of our connect callback function. I don't want to emit the event until we are connected. Socket.emit is going to let me do just that. Right here, I can call socket.emit, emitting the event. The event name is create email, and we can pass any data we like in as the second argument. In the case of an email app, we're probably going to need to send it to someone. So we'll have a to address, something like jen@example.com. We're going to need some text, obviously. Hey, this is Andrew. And we might have other properties like subject, but for now, we're going to stick with just these two. So what we've done here is we've created a client-side script that connects to the server, and as soon as it connects, it emits this create email event. Now, this is not a realistic example. In a real-world app, a user is most likely going to fill out a form. You're going to grab these pieces of data from the form, and then you're going to emit it. We will be working with HTML forms a little later. For now, though, we're just calling socket.emit to play around with these custom events. I'm going to save index.js over inside of the browser. We can now give the page a refresh. As soon as it connects, it's going to emit that event. And right here in the terminal, you see create email printing. The event was emitted from the client to the server. The server got the data and all is well. Now, another cool thing about the console is we have access to the variables created by our application, most notably this socket variable, which means inside of Google Chrome in the developer console, we can call socket.emit and we can emit whatever we like. I can emit an action, create email. I can pass in some data as the second argument, an object, where I have a a to attribute equal to Julie@example.com, and I have my other attributes too, something like text, setting that equal to hey. This is an example of how we can use the developer console to make debugging our app even easier. Right here, I can type a statement, hit enter, it's going to go ahead and fire that, emitting the event, and over inside of the terminal, we're going to get that event and do something with it, whether it's creating the email or doing anything else we might require. And right here inside of the terminal, you can see create email showed up. We're sending that one to Julie, and here's the text, hey, it all got to the server from the client. Now that we have this in place and we've played around with how we can use these custom events, it's time to move from the email application onto the actual app we're going to be building, the chat application. And to talk about what you're going to do for the challenge, we're going to head back into the presentation for just a few seconds. Now that you know how to emit and listen to custom events, we're going to move on to your challenge, which is going to be to create 2 events that we'll actually use in the chat application. These are going to be new message and create message. Now for the chat app, once again, we have our server, which is going to be the server we build, and we have our client, which is going to be a user who is in the chat application. There is most likely going to be multiple users who all want to communicate with each other. Now, the first event we're going to have is a new message event. This is going to get emitted by the server and listened to on the client. When a new message comes in, the server is going to send it to everyone connected to the chat room so they can display it to the screen and a user can go ahead and respond to it. The new message event is going to require some data. We're going to need to know who the message was from, a string of someone's name, like a string Andrew, the text of the message, something like, hey, can you meet up at 6, and a created at timestamp. All of this data is going to get rendered inside of our chat application in the browser. We'll be doing that for real in a little bit, but for now, we're just going to print it to the console. So this is the first event I want you to create. You're going to make this new message event. You're going to emit it from the server. For now, you can simply emit it when a user connects, and you're going to listen to it on the client. And for now on the client, you can just print with console.log a little message when you get the data. You can say got new message, printing the object that got passed with this data. Next up, the second event we're going to work with is create message. This is going to come from the client to the server. So if I'm user 1, I'm going to fire a create message event from my browser. This is going to go to the server, and the server is going to fire new message events to everyone else so they can see my message, which means the create message event is going to get emitted from the client, and the server is going to be the one who's listening for the event. Now, this event is also going to require some data. We're going to need to know who the message was from and also the text. What did they want to say? We need both of these pieces of information. Now, notice a discrepancy here. We're sending the from text and created at properties to the client, but we're not asking for a created at property from the client when they create a message. This created at property, it's actually going to get created on the server. This is going to prevent the user from being able to spoof the time a message was created at. There's certain properties we're going to trust the user to provide us. There's others that we will not trust them to provide us, and one of those is going to be created at. Now, for create message to do this challenge, all you have to do is set up an event listener on the server that waits for this to fire. And once again, you can simply print a message like create message, and then you can provide to console.log the data that got passed along, printing it to the terminal. Now, once you have that listener in place, you're going to want to emit it. You can emit it when the user first connects, and you can also fire a couple socket.emit calls from the Chrome developer tools, making sure that all of the messages show up in the terminal. Take some time to knock that one out. It's going to take a little bit of time. You can also remove all of the previous event listeners and event emitters that we created for our email events. We're not going to actually need those. Those were just for example purposes. Now, this is the setup video. In the next video, I'll show you how to solve this challenge since this one's getting a little long and I want to keep these under 20 minutes. Take some time to knock this out, test it, make sure everything works as expected, and when you're done, move on to the next video where I'll show you how to get this done.